He came home from his trip with his arm around another woman, acting like I was a stranger in my own house. Behind them stood her family, smiling like they owned the place. He told me to make room for them, said they'd be staying for a while. I didn't argue. I just nodded and watched him carry her bags past the same door we bought together. What he didn't know was that while he was busy replacing me, I had already started ending his life, piece by piece, in ways he wouldn't notice until it was far too late. When he walked past me, his cologne mixed with a scent I didn't recognize, something expensive and new. The kind of smell that announces a person before they even speak. It used to be my job to notice little things like that, but now I was studying him like a stranger. The way he laughed with her family in our living room told me he felt safe, untouchable. I let him. He didn't see the quiet look on my face, the one that already knew this was not a loss, but the beginning of my escape. Her family stood near the hallway, trying not to stare but doing it anyway. I could see the pity in their eyes, the kind people give to a dog left out in the rain. They whispered softly to one another, pretending I couldn't hear. I didn't need to. I already knew what they were thinking. They believed I was weak, that I'd let him walk all over me again. What they didn't know was that weakness leaves the moment you stop trying to be chosen. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning freedom. He started giving them a tour of the house, showing off every corner like it was a prize he had earned. The dining room, the backyard, the kitchen I built piece by piece when money was tight. They admired everything and thanked him like he owned it all. I stayed silent, letting him have his little parade. Every step he took made me see how far gone he was, how blind his pride had made him. But I wasn't sad. I had already moved on in my mind, even if my body still stood in that room. When he called her by a pet name, I watched his hand brush her shoulder like he was showing me something. It didn't hurt the way I thought it would. The part of me that used to ache for him had already gone quiet long before this day. I looked around at the walls, the furniture, the little signs of the life we built. It all looked temporary now. I could already picture the house empty, stripped clean of every piece he thought was his. That image didn't break me. It steadied me. The sound of the clock in the kitchen filled the silence between us. That same clock had ticked through our hardest years together, through late nights and small fights and short-lived peace. Now it ticked like a reminder that time belonged to me again. I stood by the counter and poured myself a glass of water, pretending to listen while they laughed in the other room. But I wasn't listening to them. I was listening to myself, to the quiet rhythm of a woman who had finally decided she'd had enough. He opened a bottle of wine I bought for our anniversary and poured it for her instead. She thanked him softly, her hand brushing his. I watched from across the room, calm, steady. I remembered when I thought I couldn't live without him, when I used to hold on to every word he said as if it was truth. That time was gone now. The woman I used to be would have cried. The woman standing here was waiting for the right moment to move, not out of emotion, but out of strategy. As they settled in, I quietly made my way upstairs. My feet knew exactly where to go. To the drawer where I kept my documents. The papers that held the real truth of who owned what, who paid for what, and whose name was written where. He never cared about details like that. He thought power came from noise, from being seen. But I had always known that real power hides in the fine print. As I touched the folder, I smiled to myself. I wasn't trapped here anymore. He just didn't know it yet. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around our room, his clothes on the chair, the suitcase still open, her perfume already in the air. It should have made me angry, but instead I felt detached, almost weightless. My anger had burned itself out long ago. All that was left was focus. I took out my notebook and started writing down what needed to be done. Every bill, every asset, every item, I could move quietly, without raising suspicion. He wanted to play house with his new family. Let him, I'd be gone soon. When I came back downstairs, they were sitting on the couch laughing at something on TV. My husband looked relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. Maybe that was the most insulting part. How comfortable betrayal looked on him. I took my phone and pretended to scroll while listening. They were making plans for a trip next month, talking about our vacation fund. My stomach turned at that word, but my mind stayed calm. They didn't know it yet, but that fund wouldn't exist by the time they tried to use it. Later that night, when everyone went to sleep, I walked around the house barefoot, touching walls I once painted with love. I stopped by the sofa and noticed a single red thread lying on the floor. It must have fallen from someone's scarf, but I picked it up anyway. I rolled it between my fingers, thinking how something so thin could hold things together, or be pulled loose to make everything fall apart. I placed it on the counter, beside the candle, and thought, yes, that's what I'm doing now, pulling threads, quietly. I lay in bed pretending to sleep, listening to the faint laughter from the guest room down the hall. My chest didn't tighten the way it once did. I just stared at the ceiling and thought about tomorrow. My plan wasn't about revenge. It was about control. For years I had none. Every decision passed through him. But now, with every step he took thinking he'd broken me, I was getting stronger. I smiled in the dark, not out of joy, but out of quiet relief. He gave me the final reason I needed to be free. In the morning, I made coffee for everyone. He thanked me without looking up, already busy talking about work and his new project. I nodded and listened just enough to memorize every word. He was still so sure of himself, still so certain I would stay. The irony was almost funny. I served them breakfast with steady hands and polite smiles, and not one of them noticed the storm I'd already set in motion. They thought I was passive, but I was already steps ahead, moving pieces on a board they couldn't even see. While they ate, I stepped into the office and logged into our joint account. Numbers stared back at me. Numbers I knew better than he ever would. I transferred small amounts, ones he wouldn't notice for now. I took screenshots and printed the details, filing them neatly in a folder. Every click felt like a breath of fresh air. Every page I filed was another piece of my life back in my own hands. I wasn't hiding. I was preparing. And the more I prepared, the less his words had power over me. That afternoon, I sat in the car parked outside a small cafe, holding a folder on my lap. Inside were the first documents I needed to start selling my part of the house. It wasn't illegal, not even complicated. Everything I'd built with him was half mine, and I was taking my half back. I walked inside, signed what I had to, and walked out with calm steps. No one knew what I'd just done. It felt strange, realizing freedom doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the sound of pen on paper. When I got home, he was on the phone laughing loudly. He barely noticed me. That was fine. I went straight upstairs, locked the door, and placed the new documents inside the drawer where my old wedding photos used to be. I stared at the contrast. Where love used to sit, now sat proof of my independence. I thought about the red thread again, how easy it was to pull one piece and change everything. This wasn't a breakdown. This was the build-up, the beginning of something he would never see coming. That night I watched him walk through the house like a man inspecting his kingdom. He moved with that same arrogance I once mistook for confidence. He didn't see me standing in the corner, quietly observing the way he carried himself. Every room he entered used to hold pieces of us. Now it only reflected his ego. I realized that's what I'd been living inside all along, a house built from my sacrifices and his pride. He believed ownership meant power, but soon he'd learn power only belongs to the one willing to walk away. The next morning I found myself wanting to call my mother. I wanted to tell her everything, to feel her calm voice guide me. But she had warned me about him before. She'd said a man who always needs to be right will never see you as an equal. Remembering that made me smile. I didn't need advice anymore. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't looking for rescue. I was building my own way out, quietly and carefully, because that was the only language he never learned to hear. I spent the afternoon cleaning, though not for them. I needed order before I made my next move. The house had become their playground, filled with their laughter and perfume, but under it all it was still mine. Every corner carried my fingerprints. While I wiped the counter, I noticed the ring on my finger, dull from years of wear. I slipped it off and placed it beside the sink. It didn't feel sad, it felt right. I had already stopped being his wife long ago. Now I was just making it official. That evening they sat at the table, eating the food I cooked. He didn't even thank me, just kept talking about their plans. She giggled at his every word, leaning into him like she was part of something new. I watched and nodded, letting them believe I was harmless. In my head, I recited every step I had left to finish. It wasn't anger keeping me focused, it was clarity. I wasn't fighting for what was gone. I was building the ground where he could no longer stand tall, and I was almost there. When everyone went to bed, I sat in the dark living room. The moonlight came through the blinds and rested on that single red thread I had found earlier. I picked it up again, winding it around my finger. It looked fragile, but it held firm. It reminded me of myself, stretched, tested, but not broken. I thought about how one small thread could unravel an entire design if pulled the right way. That was my plan in one image. I didn't need to fight him head-on. I would pull gently and watch everything collapse. The next morning I gathered documents. The house deed, investment receipts, account passwords. He never cared for these things. To him it was boring paperwork. To me it was quiet power. I laid them out on the table and started sorting. The sound of the paper sliding over the wood felt strangely satisfying. I wasn't rushing. I knew every signature, every date. It was all legal and all mine to move. He thought I was too emotional to handle money. He didn't realize emotion had nothing to do with intelligence or survival. When I heard him laughing from the other room, something inside me settled. I used to shake when he spoke to me like that, pretending his dominance was charm, but now his voice sounded distant, almost empty. I realized how small he truly was when stripped of control. I smiled faintly, organizing the last of the folders. He believed I'd always orbit around him, but I was done being his reflection. I was my own world now, and while he was busy playing house, I was preparing to disappear from his story completely. I bought a new box that afternoon, small and plain. I filled it with the papers that mattered most and tucked it away under my bed. That box became my secret heartbeat, steady and silent. Every time I passed the room where they laughed, I reminded myself that box was my escape. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming everything I had built with my hands. He had no idea I was already halfway gone, walking out of this house one decision at a time. I only needed a little more time. I started selling small things first. The painting he never liked, the old watch he forgot about, the decorative vase that only collected dust. One by one, I found buyers online and shipped them out. He didn't notice. He never paid attention to details unless they benefited him. Each sale brought in quiet money, enough to build a cushion. I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. These weren't his losses. They were my recoveries. Every package I sealed felt like a step closer to breathing on my own again. and that was worth everything. A neighbor saw me loading boxes into my car and waved. I waved back with a smile that hid everything. People always assume women in my position are broken, that will beg for sympathy. But I didn't need sympathy. I needed silence and space to finish what I started. I drove to a nearby consignment shop, sold another piece, and watched the cash slide across the counter. It was such a small thing, yet it carried a feeling I hadn't felt in years: control. The kind that doesn't need permission to exist. When I came home, he was talking loudly on the phone about business deals that didn't exist. He liked sounding important. He always did. I walked past him without a word, my keys jingling softly. He asked where I'd been, and I told him I was out running errands. That was technically true. He didn't question me. He never did when he believed he still had me figured out. I almost laughed thinking how blind confidence can be. He had no idea his empire was being dismantled by the woman he underestimated most. That night I sat at the dining table after everyone went to bed. I opened my laptop, double-checked transfer confirmations, and sent a few more payments to the new account I had opened in my name. Everything was clean, traceable, and legal. The numbers added up slowly, but each one represented something he'd taken for granted. I wasn't stealing, I was reclaiming. I turned off the laptop and looked around the dark room. It didn't feel like my home anymore. It felt like a shell I was shedding, one paper and password at a time. The following morning, I heard church bells echo from down the street. It was strange, I hadn't noticed them before. The sound was distant but clear, steady, and calm. I stood by the window listening. Something about that rhythm made me feel guided, like life was marking time with me. Every ring felt like a quiet countdown, not of loss, but of freedom approaching. I folded my arms, looked around the half-empty room, and whispered to myself that I was almost ready. My plan was working, and the world seemed to know it too. By now I had written a full schedule of what to sell and when. It sat folded inside my journal, next to a note that said, "Keep moving." Every morning I opened it and checked off another step. The more I organized, the lighter I felt. I no longer woke up wondering what he would do or say. My thoughts were mine again, clean and quiet. He kept pretending we were normal, that I was still part of his story, but my story was already separate now. He just hadn't realized he'd been written out. I withdrew some money from an old account he didn't know existed. It was small but symbolic. I tucked the envelope in my purse and felt like I was holding the key to a door he could never open. I didn't need much, just enough to start over somewhere new. For the first time in years, the future didn't scare me. It excited me. The sound of laughter from the living room reached me again, but I only smiled. They could laugh all they wanted. I had already taken the first real step toward peace. Before I continue, I want to pause for a second. If you're still listening to my story, it means you understand what quiet strength feels like. So while we go on, take a moment to support this channel, like the video, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It means more than you know. Now let's continue, because the part that comes next is when everything he thought he controlled starts slipping through his fingers and he doesn't even realize it's happening. I sold the car next. It was registered in both our names, but I'd made every payment. I handled the transfer cleanly through a dealer who didn't ask questions. I walked out with a bank check and a weight lifted off my shoulders. When he noticed the car missing, I told him I took it for maintenance. He didn't even look up from his phone. That's how blind he'd become. I cashed the check, stored the funds safely, and smiled at how easy freedom can be when the other person never believes you're capable. Her family started bringing in boxes, clothes, dishes, decorations. It was like they were trying to bury my life under theirs. I watched them set things up, laughing as they worked, pretending not to see me. But I saw everything. I saw how quickly people fill spaces they don't own. I didn't stop them. I let them build their little dream, because soon the walls they decorated wouldn't belong to any of them. Every item they placed made my decision easier. The more they took over, the faster I disappeared from under their feet. I opened the top drawer in my office and looked at the empty space where I used to keep family photos. I'd removed them weeks ago, replacing them with documents. The space looked clean, stripped of sentiment. I liked it that way. Emotion used to guide me, but now, precision did. I pulled out a folder labeled Final Transfers and double-checked every detail. It was ready. I sat back in my chair, listening to faint laughter from the living room. That laughter didn't sting anymore, it just reminded me how far I'd come. On Sunday the bells rang again. Their sound reached through the open window, steady and bright. I stood there holding my coffee, and let the noise fill the quiet between thoughts. I didn't believe in signs, but it felt like the world was echoing my steps. Every time those bells rang, I felt closer to my goal. I checked my calendar and circled the day I'd close everything. It was soon, too soon for him to notice, but perfect for me to leave cleanly. I smiled softly, sipping coffee like it was any other morning. I took photos of all the documents on my phone, then deleted the images once the digital copies were stored securely. The process felt almost ritualistic, like a small ceremony of closure. Paper by paper, file by file, I reduced years of life into numbers and names. He still believed he was the provider, the protector, the man in charge, but the truth sat inside my phone now, encrypted and safe. I didn't need confrontation. I didn't need noise. I just needed to keep walking the quiet path that would lead me out. He decided to host a dinner for her family. He wanted to show them he was generous, successful, and charming. I stayed polite, setting the table and serving the food while he bragged about our finances as if they were his alone. Her parents smiled, proud of him. I nodded through the whole night, calm, careful. None of them noticed the papers missing from the office or that the laptop bag now carried empty folders. It was strange watching someone brag about what was already gone, like a magician unaware his trick had failed. That night after they left the table, I sat alone with the dirty dishes and the silence. I didn't feel tired. I felt satisfied. I rinsed each plate, thinking about how much energy I used to spend trying to be enough for him. Love had been my full-time job once, and now I was finally retired. When I finished cleaning, I turned off the lights, paused by the window, and whispered a quiet thank you to myself for surviving. Tomorrow would be another small step, another page turned towards something better. In the morning, I met a buyer for an antique piece I owned long before him. We met at a small cafe near downtown. The buyer smiled, handed me the money, and left. I sat there with my coffee afterward, looking at the envelope on the table. It wasn't about the amount, it was about what it represented. I was earning back my independence one sale at a time. I walked back to my car and thought about the version of me that used to ask permission for everything. That woman was gone for good. When I got home, I saw a new photo stuck to the fridge, him and her, arms around each other, smiling like a family. For a moment I just looked at it, not out of pain but realization. That picture wasn't mine to be angry about. It was a symbol of everything I was leaving behind. I opened the fridge, took out a bottle of water and closed the door gently. They could have their smiles. I had my silence, my plans, and my freedom inching closer every day. That was all I needed now. I stood in the doorway watching him pin that photo to the fridge, proud of his little trophy moment. The same fridge once covered in vacation pictures and grocery lists now held a life I was no longer part of. I didn't feel bitterness, only clarity. People show you who they are when they think you have no choice but to stay. I took a slow breath, turned away and reminded myself that everything he thought was permanent was already shifting under his feet. He just hadn't realized the ground was already gone. The next morning I called the realtor to push up the showing date. My voice was calm, friendly, like any normal client. I told her I'd signed the updated documents she sent last week and confirmed the closing schedule. She said everything looked great. I smiled as I hung up. It was strange how easy it all was. Just paperwork and patience. He thought control came from force, but in the real world it came from signatures and timing. By the time he caught on, the door would already be closed behind me. Early that morning, while everyone slept, I quietly reviewed every document. The papers were stacked neatly in front of me, my handwriting filling the margins with notes. The sound of that distant bell reached through the window again, soft but sure, marking another step forward. I placed my signature where it needed to be, pressed the pen firmly, and sealed the envelope. My name looked different to me now, strong, final, self-owned. I wasn't erasing the past. I was taking authorship of it, one signed line at a time, with nobody there to stop me. Later, while he bragged to her family about our investments, I watched them quietly. He puffed his chest like a performer who'd memorized the wrong lines. They nodded politely, impressed by his confidence. I sipped my drink and smiled, knowing half the things he boasted about weren't his anymore. Pride is a strange thing. It blinds people to the truth standing right in front of them. I didn't need to expose him. I just needed to let his illusion keep running, because the louder he talked, the less he saw what was actually happening. I started taking one small thing every day. A few clothes, some jewelry, small keepsakes that mattered only to me. I didn't rush, I just picked them carefully, placed them in a box, and put it in the trunk of my car. Each trip was quiet, almost therapeutic. He didn't notice anything missing, and even if he had, he'd never imagine what I was doing. I wasn't fleeing, I was reclaiming, and for the first time in years, every choice I made didn't need to be justified or explained. It simply belonged to me. That red thread kept showing up. I'd find it in different places. The floor, the hallway, even the laundry basket. I wasn't superstitious, but it felt like a sign. I'd roll it up and keep it in my pocket. A small reminder that one pull could undo everything false. Whenever I touched it, I remembered who I was before him, capable, smart, and whole. The thread became my quiet anchor. It didn't belong to anyone else. It existed only because I chose to see it, and somehow, that made me feel powerful again. I packed a box labeled donations, but inside it I hid an envelope containing old account details I'd already emptied. It was my way of cleaning house both literally and emotionally. The act felt symbolic, giving away what didn't serve me anymore while keeping what mattered most safe. He was still strutting around, talking big about future plans, unaware the foundation beneath him was paper thin. I didn't need to expose him. I wanted him to expose himself. His pride would do the work for me, and it was working better than I imagined. He gathered everyone in the living room that night, lecturing about financial discipline and gratitude. He liked the sound of his own voice too much to realize I wasn't even listening. Her family nodded as if they were attending one of his sermons. I sat in the corner, calm, letting him think he still ran the show. But I noticed something in her face, doubt. Even she could sense cracks in his stories. It was only a matter of time before his mask slipped. I didn't need to push it. Truth always finds its way. The next morning I went to the bank. I wore plain clothes and a steady expression, looking like any other customer. I updated a few account settings, changed access privileges, and confirmed every signature twice. When I walked out, I felt lighter. The air outside smelled new, like the world had quietly shifted in my favor. He was home bragging about upcoming projects, not realizing those accounts were now locked from him. I wasn't hiding. I was protecting what I built. For once the system worked in favor of the woman who paid attention. Back home, she asked me where the good plates were. I told her, pointing to a cabinet that was already half empty. She smiled, clueless that those dishes would soon belong to someone else. I watched her unpack her own things, setting them where mine used to be. It didn't hurt the way it might have before. It just confirmed what I already knew. She was decorating a house that wasn't going to be hers for long. The real transfer wasn't between people. It was between power and peace. And I had chosen peace. At night I sat by the window again. The church bell echoed faintly from down the street. I let the sound fill the room and calm me. That bell had become my marker, reminding me that every plan has rhythm. I knew exactly how many days were left before everything would be finalized. The more I listened, the more it felt like time was working with me, not against me. I wasn't scared anymore. The fear had turned into focus, and that focus had become my freedom in motion. The countdown had truly begun. The next day, I sold some stocks under my name. It was a small sale but symbolic. I watched the numbers update on the screen, feeling like each zero was a boundary forming between me and him. He never believed I understood finance. He called it his world. Yet here I was, moving through it with precision. Knowledge was the quiet rebellion he never saw coming. When the transfer completed, I smiled at the confirmation email. It wasn't about the money. It was about proving to myself that I was capable all along. He noticed a few changes in the statements that arrived by mail. He asked me casually if I'd made any purchases. I told him I was catching up on small things we'd overlooked. He nodded, distracted, and moved on. His arrogance was my shield. It made him predictable. He assumed control gave him awareness, but it blinded him instead. Every time he underestimated me, he handed me more power without realizing it. I went back to folding laundry, humming quietly, hiding my satisfaction in the ordinary rhythm of everyday chores. That evening I sat with my laptop, reviewing all transactions. Everything was lining up perfectly. I sent polite follow-up messages to the agents and buyers, thanking them and confirming completion. The responses came back swiftly, each one marking another step toward independence. I closed the laptop and sat still for a moment, realizing I had become someone else entirely. The woman who once begged for understanding had turned into a strategist. I didn't need to shout to be heard anymore. My silence was doing all the speaking I needed. He moved a framed certificate from one wall to another and asked why I kept it. I told him it reminded me that I could finish what I start. He chuckled, thinking it was just small talk. But that certificate, my college degree, had always been proof of my resilience. It represented a part of me he could never claim. I stood there watching him hang it crooked, and instead of fixing it, I walked away. That crooked frame was the perfect symbol for our marriage, something once straight, now hanging wrong, no longer worth adjusting. Later I bought a bus ticket under my name and slipped it into my coat pocket. I didn't know where I'd go yet, but the act itself mattered. It was a promise I could touch. Something physical that meant escape was no longer just an idea. The paper felt soft between my fingers. I kept it there near my heart, like a small seed of courage. He could have his new love and her family. I had something far stronger, a future that didn't include begging for space in my own life. The neighbors started to notice my calmness. One woman stopped me by the mailbox, asking how things were going. I smiled and said everything was fine. She looked at me for a moment, maybe sensing more than I said, but I didn't owe explanations anymore. People love drama, but I was finished performing. I wanted quiet victories now. As I walked back inside, I felt the bus ticket in my coat pocket like a heartbeat. Every small step I took was building momentum. I was almost ready to disappear and start fresh. That night she cooked dinner for everyone. The smell filled the kitchen, rich and warm. They laughed together, clinking glasses and telling stories like they'd been here forever. I sat at the edge of the table, tasting the food, nodding politely. It wasn't bad, it was just unfamiliar. I realized I didn't resent her anymore. She was just another person fooled by his charm. I wasn't competing with her. I was leaving them both behind. When I stood up from the table, I felt lighter than I had in years. Later that night, I handed a signed check to one of the buyers who'd come by for a final pickup. The exchange was quick, simple, and done in silence. When I closed the door behind them, I leaned against it for a moment, breathing out the tension that used to own me. Every deal completed was a quiet declaration. I was in charge now. The house around me no longer felt like a cage. It was just a setting, a place I'd outgrown. And once you outgrow a place, leaving it isn't loss, it's growth. He started talking loudly about how successful he'd been lately, listing fake numbers to her family as if they were proof. They nodded along, impressed, while he bragged about being the one who built everything. I stood nearby, invisible but listening. He didn't know the irony in his own words. The very empire he claimed credit for was already gone, piece by piece, sold or transferred by me. I didn't feel angry anymore. I just watched him talk, amazed by how confidently people can lie even when the truth is closing in. The next day, I made arrangements with a moving company. I scheduled them for a weekday morning when he'd be out running errands. I used a different name for the booking, keeping the details private. The voice on the phone didn't question me. It was just another transaction, but to me, it was everything. That date on the calendar wasn't just a move, it was my rebirth. I hung up the phone, marked the day, and smiled at how simple it felt to plan something that would completely rewrite the story of my life. While cleaning my coat pocket, the red thread slipped out again. I held it up to the light, noticing how the color seemed brighter now. It reminded me of all the strings I used to tie myself to people who didn't value me. I twisted it gently around my finger, watching it form a small ring. It didn't symbolize marriage anymore. It symbolized self-connection. I tucked it back into my pocket with the bus ticket, feeling them together like two parts of the same promise. The courage to leave and the will to begin again. That evening, I called my sister. I didn't tell her everything, just that I might need a place to stay soon. She didn't ask many questions. She's always been the type to understand what silence means. Her voice felt like a bridge to safety, something steady waiting on the other side. I hung up feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. I wasn't alone. Not really. I had distanced myself for years. But the people who truly loved me had never stopped being there. I just needed to walk toward them. A short message came from my sister the next day. It was simple, come. That one word felt like permission to finally breathe. I reread it several times, letting it sink in. I didn't have to explain myself. I didn't have to justify leaving. Family didn't always mean shared blood. It meant shared safety. Her message gave me the final push I needed. I folded the paper, placed it beside my bus ticket, and whispered a small thank you under my breath. I wasn't scared anymore. I was ready to go home. That night I began clearing out the last of the closet. The clothes we bought together hung lifeless on the hangers. I separated what was mine and placed the rest aside. It wasn't about sentiment. It was about space. Space for a new life, a new version of me. I folded each item carefully, feeling the weight of the past lighten with every piece I packed. By the time I finished, the closet looked bare, almost peaceful. I sat down on the floor and whispered to myself, almost done, and I meant it. He pinned a note to the refrigerator about a dinner party he wanted to host. It was written in his messy handwriting like an order instead of an idea. I looked at it and smiled faintly. He still believed he controlled the rhythm of this house, but he was living in a version of reality that no longer existed. I folded the note, tucked it into my pocket, and went back to packing. Every plan he made became one more reminder that I was already gone, even if my body hadn't left yet. When the realtor called later that week, her tone was cheerful. The buyer had approved everything. She congratulated me like it was a new beginning. And in a way it was. I thanked her, pretending to be calm. But inside I felt a release so powerful, it almost startled me. The house was no longer ours. Soon it wouldn't even be his problem. I signed the last papers that afternoon, and took a quiet walk afterward. The street looked the same, but I knew the world had just shifted completely in my favor. That night I packed a small bag, the essentials only: clothes, documents, the bus ticket, the red thread. I kept it under the bed where I could grab it quickly. The sound of her laughter echoed faintly from the living room. I listened without emotion. That sound used to cut deep. Now it was just background noise. I checked the calendar on my phone and circled the day the movers were scheduled. 2 days. That was all I needed, to keep breathing like nothing had changed until everything had. 2 days until silence became freedom. The morning of the move, the distant bell rang again. It was faint but steady, almost like it was keeping time with me. I took it as my cue. I opened the curtains wide, letting the sunlight spill in. The movers arrived on time, polite and quiet. I gave them the boxes I'd labeled storage, and they carried them out without questions. He wasn't home, she waved from the kitchen, still in her robe, unaware of what was happening around her. I didn't explain. Not every truth needs words. Some are better left to timing. When they left, I sat at the table with the last document in front of me. The pen felt heavier than usual, as if it knew what this moment meant. I wrote my name one final time, pressed the paper flat, and exhaled. The house was sold. The accounts were mine. The future was open. I didn't cry. I just looked around at the walls one last time. Every mark, every dent, every trace of us, it all stayed behind. I was walking out lighter, carrying only what mattered, proof that I could survive anything. He came home that evening looking suspicious. He walked around the house, scanning the rooms like something felt off. Maybe he noticed the missing furniture or the bare shelves. He asked why it felt emptier. She brushed it off, saying we must be redecorating. I stayed quiet, sipping tea and pretending to read. His unease pleased me, not out of spite, but justice. For once he was the one questioning the world around him. I didn't need to explain anything. The truth was already standing right in front of him, invisible but solid. I drove to the storage unit after dark. The boxes sat neatly stacked, everything important sealed and safe. I stood there for a while, looking at them like old friends I'd finally rescued. I placed a small note on top of one, for my new life. It felt childish, but meaningful. The hum of the city outside sounded distant, like another planet. I closed the unit, locked it, and placed the key on my necklace chain. For the first time in a long while, I had something worth protecting that was entirely mine. The next morning, the movers came for the remaining boxes. She thanked them as if she'd arranged everything herself. I let her believe that. It didn't matter. Every signature, every receipt, every legal step was already done in my name. She was living inside an illusion I had built for my own exit. As they carried out the last few boxes, she smiled at me like we were sharing something. Maybe in a way we were. I was giving her what she thought she wanted. What she didn't know was how temporary it all was. When I checked my phone later that afternoon, all the transfers were complete. Every account had shifted exactly as planned. The final confirmation came with a timestamp that felt like closure. I sat in the car staring at the message, letting it sink in. Everything was done. Everything was done. I didn't feel the rush I expected. Just calm. The kind that comes when you've spent too long being afraid and finally have no reason to be. I leaned back in the seat, closed my eyes and smiled quietly to myself. It was finished. That night he called my phone asking about a bill that hadn't gone through. I let it ring. When the second call came, I silenced it. He'd spent years believing I'd always answer, always fix, always be there. Not this time. My silence was my reply. I left the phone face down on the table and poured myself a glass of water. It tasted better than anything I'd had in months. There's something about peace. It has no sound, but once you have it, it fills the room in a way nothing else can. I looked out the window and saw him standing in the backyard, pointing things out to her. He was showing her the garden, the one we built together with our hands and late nights. I used to love that space. Now it just looked like dirt and memories. He smiled proudly as if he'd done it all himself. I watched him gesture toward the flowers I'd planted and couldn't help but laugh softly. He was giving away a story that wasn't his to tell, and I had finally stopped caring enough to correct him. Later that night I sat in my car again. The red thread lay on the passenger seat, uncoiled and bright in the faint streetlight. I picked it up, turning it in my hand, thinking about how far I'd come. Every lie he told had once tied me down. Now those same threads had become markers showing me the path out. I tied the red string into a small loop and hung it on the rearview mirror. It wasn't superstition, it was a reminder that I'd pulled every thread I needed and the fabric was finally free. While sitting there, I thought back to one small decision years ago. The night I forgave him for something I shouldn't have. That was the moment I lost my power. I'd chosen peace over truth, thinking it would save us. It didn't. It only taught him I'd tolerate pain quietly. That memory didn't hurt anymore. It just reminded me how far I'd traveled from that version of myself. Forgiveness is good, but only when it's deserved. I had forgiven too much for too long. Now I was saving that grace for myself. I realized something as I drove away from the house that night. I had always wanted closeness, but I kept finding myself drawn to people who only understood control. I used to think love meant fixing others, keeping the peace, holding things together, but I'd been wrong. Love wasn't about staying, it was about seeing clearly. I couldn't save him, and I didn't want to anymore. What I wanted now was distance, the kind of distance that doesn't come from anger, but from finally knowing your own worth. That was my true freedom. I parked near the park where I used to walk when things got bad. I took the red thread out again and tied a small knot in it. It felt like sealing something, a promise to myself that I would never shrink again. The street lights flickered across the pavement, and for the first time the world felt open, like I could go anywhere. I tucked the thread back in my pocket, touched the bus ticket beside it, and smiled. I didn't have to know where I was going. I just had to keep going. The next day I visited the bank again to hand over the final paperwork. The clerk was kind, polite, and efficient. Everything was finalized without trouble. I signed my name one last time, and when she handed me the stamped documents, I thanked her sincerely. That moment didn't feel like business, it felt like liberation dressed up as routine. I stepped outside and felt the sunlight on my face. People walked past me, busy with their own lives, unaware they were witnessing someone quietly reclaiming her future. It felt good to blend in again. Later, I got a text from him. It was a photo of him and her at dinner with her family, captioned with something smug about new beginnings. I stared at it for a second and deleted it without a word. The old me would have cried. The new me felt nothing. He was celebrating something that didn't exist anymore, a version of life already gone. I turned off my phone and focused on the sounds of traffic outside my window. The world kept moving, and for once, I wasn't left behind. I was ahead. I spent the afternoon volunteering at a women's shelter downtown. It wasn't planned. I just walked in, offered to help, and they said yes. I unpacked donations, folded clothes, and listened to stories that reminded me how strong people can be after loss. Every woman there had survived something different, but we all shared one thing: we were still standing. As I worked, I realized I wasn't just leaving him. I was joining something bigger, a quiet sisterhood of women who learned how to rebuild themselves, brick by brick, without asking for permission. Before leaving the shelter, one of the women handed me a paper with local resources written on it. She said, "Just in case." I smiled and folded it into my bag. I didn't need it right now, but I knew how life worked. Preparedness was peace. I walked back to my car feeling grounded. The city lights glowed softer that evening. Or maybe I was just seeing them differently. The world hadn't changed, only I had. That thought made me realize how power never really leaves you. Sometimes it just waits for you to notice it. That night the church bell rang again. I was lying on the couch of my small rented room, staring at the ceiling. The sound came through the open window, calm and steady. It didn't sound like a warning anymore. It sounded like a beginning. I thought of how much fear I'd lived under, how small I used to make myself just to keep peace. The bell kept ringing, and I smiled quietly. I didn't know where this path would lead, but I knew one thing for sure: I'd never belong to anyone but myself again. I slept better that night than I had in years. No alarms, no waiting for footsteps in the hallway, no pretending everything was fine, just quiet. I woke up early and made myself breakfast: toast, eggs, and black coffee. It wasn't fancy, but it tasted like ownership. My phone buzzed a few times, but I ignored it. My world no longer revolved around that sound. I opened the window and let the morning light fill the small kitchen. Freedom didn't look like fireworks. It looked like peace, so ordinary it almost felt unreal. He called again later that day, this time leaving a voicemail. His tone was softer now, uncertain. He asked where I was, said he wanted to talk. I played the message once, then deleted it. There was a time when hearing his voice would have broken me. Now it just reminded me of everything I'd outgrown. I didn't need closure from him. The real closure was knowing I didn't need him to understand. Some stories end without applause. Some endings happen quietly, when you finally stop chasing what was never meant to stay. She posted photos from the house, her standing in my old kitchen, him smiling behind her. The comments poured in with words like beautiful couple and new beginnings. I scrolled for a second and then closed the app. Let them have their moment. I didn't feel jealous. I felt free. I knew what those smiles hid. I'd worn them myself once, smiling through disappointment and pretending to be happy. They were just starting the same cycle I'd finally escaped. I turned off my phone and took a deep breath that felt like truth. Later that evening I double-checked the last details. Address changes, updated contacts, everything lined up perfectly. The work was complete. My new life wasn't waiting anymore, it had already started. I packed the final items into my small suitcase and zipped it shut. The sound of the zipper closing felt like punctuation. This chapter was finished. I didn't cry and I didn't celebrate. I just stood there in silence, proud of the woman who had quietly turned pain into a plan. Some victories don't need to be loud to be real. As the sun went down, I sat near the window with a cup of tea. The city hummed outside, people walking, cars passing, life continuing as usual. But for me, everything was different. I'd taken back my name, my choices, my peace. I thought about the girl who once begged him to see her, and how far she'd come. I wasn't invisible anymore, not to him, not to anyone, and definitely not to myself. I took a final sip of tea, smiled softly, and whispered, "I made it." And I truly had. I sat on a bus heading out of town, the red thread resting in my palm. The road stretched long and quiet, lined with trees that blurred into a rhythm. I didn't look back. The house, the noise, the chaos, it could all stay behind me. Every mile between us felt like a layer of weight falling off my shoulders. I didn't have a destination yet, but that didn't matter. Sometimes freedom isn't a place, it's the space between what hurt you and what comes next. And I was finally sitting right in that space. When I arrived at the cafe where my sister worked, she was already waiting. Her eyes softened when she saw me. We didn't talk much, she just pulled out a chair and let me sit. I handed her an envelope with my documents, the ones proving everything was settled. She looked at it, then back at me, and nodded. No questions, no judgment, just quiet support. That was all I needed. It felt like safety, not in the walls or the papers, but in knowing someone was on my side again. We sat there for a while, sipping coffee. The hum of conversation around us filled the silence we didn't need to break. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd felt peace like that. My sister didn't try to fix anything, she just let me be. Sometimes love looks like stillness, not advice. When I stood to leave, she gave me a small folded note. "You're stronger than you think," it said. I tucked it in with the red thread. Maybe strength wasn't built overnight. It was rebuilt quietly, one choice at a time. That evening she handed me a small key to an apartment she'd found through a friend. It was nothing fancy, just a one-bedroom place with old floors and sunlight in the morning. I accepted it with a smile that felt genuine for the first time in a long time. Holding that key felt like holding a new identity. Not someone's wife, not someone's helper, just me. I carried my small suitcase inside later that night, turned the lock, and stood there breathing in the silence. It wasn't empty, it was waiting for life to begin. A message popped up on my phone that night. It was from him. "You can't survive without me," he wrote. The words should have hurt, but they didn't. They just looked small on the screen, like echoes from a person who didn't matter anymore. I didn't reply. I didn't even delete it. I just left it there as proof of how much power he'd lost. He still thought survival meant money or comfort. He never understood it meant peace. I put my phone down and smiled. He was wrong about me. He always had been. I made tea and sat by the window watching the quiet street outside. The air smelled clean, untouched by anything familiar. I realized I didn't feel lonely. I felt open. The space around me wasn't silence, it was possibility. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone to come home, to choose me, to make plans that included me. I had plans of my own now, even if they were simple. Eat well, sleep well, heal. It didn't sound like much, but it was more than I'd had in years, and it was enough. That night, as I walked down the street to buy groceries, I heard a distant bell ring again. It sounded softer here, but still steady. I paused for a moment, smiling at the thought that it had followed me somehow. Maybe it wasn't a bell at all. Maybe it was just my reminder that life keeps moving forward. I carried my groceries home, the bag light in my hand. For the first time, I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking towards something new, even if I didn't yet know its name. When I got home, I unpacked the small groceries and placed everything neatly on the shelf. The simple act felt grounding. I'd spent so many years cleaning up other people's messes that caring for my own space felt almost sacred. I thought of the woman I used to be, worried, apologetic, always walking on eggshells. She didn't exist here. This apartment wasn't big, but it was mine. I looked around the quiet room and realized I didn't need anyone's permission to be happy. Happiness wasn't loud. It was a clean shelf and a calm heart. A week later, I heard he'd gone to the bank trying to reverse some of the transfers. I knew it wouldn't work. Everything had been handled cleanly and legally. Still, I imagined the look on his face when he realized the accounts were empty. The property's gone, the safety net he'd relied on replaced by his own arrogance. I didn't feel cruel thinking about it. I felt balanced. Life has a way of giving back what people send out. He gave me pain, and I gave him consequence. That seemed fair to me. He visited the financial office next, demanding answers. The staff showed him my signed forms, the authorization letters, the notarized copies with my name. They explained everything had been legitimate. He raised his voice, but they stayed calm. Paper doesn't lie. The truth was written in ink, witnessed, sealed, and filed. He couldn't argue with that. I'd played by the rules, just better than he ever imagined I could. That thought didn't make me smug. It made me grateful. For once I'd fought clean and still won. That was the best kind of victory. He started calling mutual friends, asking if they knew where I'd gone. Some ignored him. Others told him to leave me alone. A few messaged me to say they were proud of me, that they hadn't realized how bad things had been. I thanked them, but I didn't explain. I didn't need to. I'd spent enough time justifying my pain. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about moving forward. The past didn't need retelling. It just needed to stay behind, where it belonged, with the man who refused to grow. A neighbor from my old street called to tell me he'd been standing outside the house asking questions. He looked lost, she said, pacing the sidewalk like a man who'd misplaced his own name. I thanked her for telling me and wished her well. I felt no satisfaction hearing it, just peace. Maybe for the first time I understood what letting go truly meant. It wasn't about punishing someone for what they did. It was about refusing to let them keep living rent-free in your mind, and I had finally evicted him. He posted something online, a vague quote about betrayal and loyalty. It was almost laughable. The same man who had brought his lover into our home was now crying victim to his small audience. I didn't react. Silence was my language now. Every time he reached for attention, he reminded me how fragile his pride was without someone feeding it. I wasn't angry. I just pitied him a little. You can't build love on ownership. It crumbles. I knew he'd learn that eventually, just like I'd learned to stop chasing broken people. Later, someone sent me a picture he'd posted, him standing outside the house, looking tired and older. There was no smile this time. No pride. Just a man realizing the cost of his arrogance. For a moment, I felt a flicker of sadness, not for what we lost, but for what he never became. He had every chance to change, and never did. I folded my phone shut and looked around my small apartment. The light spilling across the floor reminded me that regret wasn't my burden anymore. I'd already paid my dues. He tried to reach out to her family next, but they were starting to see through him. The lies he told didn't line up. The money he bragged about was gone. I didn't need to do anything. The truth was unraveling itself. It always does. I focused on my job search, updating my resume, and applying to positions that felt stable. Starting over didn't scare me. I'd already done the hardest part, leaving. Everything after that was just living. And for the first time I was ready to do that without apology. He started arguing with her family about money, trying to blame me for his losses. They didn't believe him. One of them even reached out to ask if I was okay. I told them I was fine and wished them peace. That was all. I didn't hold anger toward them either. They were caught in his storm just like I once was. I had no desire to see anyone else suffer. I'd learned that real freedom doesn't come from destruction. It comes from peace that doesn't depend on someone else's downfall. He made one last attempt to control the story by telling people I'd stolen from him. But when they looked at the records, they saw everything was legal. My name, my rights, my half. The truth was too solid to bend. That must have hurt him more than anything. The realization that I hadn't broken the law, or lost my composure. I'd simply played smarter. The woman he once mocked for being too quiet had won without raising her voice. That, I think, is the kind of victory that leaves no room for argument. His calls became less frequent after that. I think he finally understood there was no way back. The silence between us stretched wide, but instead of feeling like distance, it felt like safety. Every day I didn't hear from him was a small celebration. I used to think closure came from confrontation. Now I knew it came from peace and disinterest. When I stopped needing him to see me, I saw myself more clearly than ever. That was the real closure, the kind that doesn't depend on anyone else's recognition. One evening my sister and I sat outside her house drinking lemonade. The sun dipped low and the air smelled like fresh grass. She told me I looked different, lighter, calmer. I laughed because I felt it too. The woman she used to worry about had vanished. I didn't talk much about him. There was nothing left to say. Sometimes healing doesn't look like dramatic moments. It looks like sitting in peace, enjoying something simple without waiting for it to be taken away. That night, I felt normal again, and that was everything. A friend from our old neighborhood told me he'd shown up at the storage unit demanding to see what I kept. The manager turned him away, explaining everything was registered solely in my name. Hearing that made me smile softly. Not out of spite, but gratitude. Systems he used to weaponize against me were now protecting me. Maybe the world wasn't fair, but for once fairness had found me in small practical ways. I didn't need revenge. Paperwork and patience had already done what anger never could, given me closure. He still tried to spin stories calling me unstable, saying I'd lost everything. It didn't work. People saw the truth in my calmness. The louder he spoke, the more foolish he looked. I used to defend myself against every rumor. Now I just let silence do the work. You can't argue with peace. It makes noise look small. I learned that protecting your energy is better than proving your innocence. People will believe what they want, but time always sides with truth. I just had to stay still long enough to let it speak. One of her relatives sent me a message saying she'd started to question his story. They'd noticed the inconsistencies, the half-truths. I didn't respond. I didn't need validation from anyone connected to that house. The point wasn't to prove who was right. The point was to live without needing proof at all. I realized that real independence isn't about leaving. It's about not needing to be seen while you rise. I had already risen, quietly without applause. That more than anything was the kind of strength I never knew I had. He began to panic when his job applications failed and his debts grew. I heard from someone that he'd started blaming everyone but himself. It didn't surprise me. Accountability was never his strong suit. Still, I hoped in some distant corner of his heart, he'd learned something from all this. Not for my sake, but for his own humanity. People like him rarely do though. They just keep spinning stories to avoid the mirror. I stopped wishing for his change that day. My peace didn't depend on his growth anymore. It depended on mine. I got a call from a friend offering me a small job at her company. It wasn't much, but it was honest work. I accepted right away. It felt good to say yes to something that didn't come with conditions or manipulation. My first paycheck came a few weeks later. I held it in my hands and smiled. It wasn't about the amount, it was about what it represented: stability. I could build from here. I could live from here. After everything, having a fresh start felt like the rarest gift of all. My days found rhythm again. Work, coffee, home. Nothing extraordinary, but it was peaceful. I started to see new faces, kind people who didn't look at me through the shadow of my past. One of them told me I had a calm energy. That made me laugh a little. I used to think calmness meant weakness. Now I understood it was power. Control over myself, not anyone else. I walked home that evening with my small bag and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Genuine contentment. I was finally living on my own terms. As the weeks passed, my new job started to feel natural. I woke up early, brewed coffee, and watched the sunrise from my small window. I liked the routine. It was steady, peaceful, and entirely mine. The people at work treated me with respect, not pity. They didn't know my past, and that was perfect. I didn't need to be anyone's story anymore. I was just a woman, rebuilding quietly, piece by piece. Every paycheck reminded me that I had rebuilt my own foundation, one that no one could take from me again. Meanwhile, his life began to unravel. I didn't look for updates, but they found me anyway. A neighbor mentioned that the party he threw for her family ended in embarrassment. People discovered he'd exaggerated his finances. His mask had slipped, and everyone saw the truth I'd lived with for years. She left him soon after, taking her family with her. It wasn't revenge that made me feel calm hearing it. It was balance. Life had a way of setting things straight, not through anger, but through quiet consequence. He was living his own lessons now. He called once more, his number flashing on my screen. I let it ring until it stopped. Then it rang again, and I silenced it. He left a message that sounded tired, not proud. He said he didn't recognize his own life anymore. I didn't reply. I'd learned that closure doesn't come from talking, it comes from walking away and meaning it. His voice didn't hold power anymore. It was just noise from a chapter I'd already closed. I deleted the message and felt lighter, as if a door I didn't even know was open had finally shut. I bought a small lamp for my apartment, a soft, warm light that filled the corners with comfort. It wasn't much, but it made the space feel like home. I'd never realized how much peace came from small things done with intention. Every evening I'd switch it on, sit by the window and write down one good thing about my day. They were simple: finishing work on time, making a new friend, cooking a meal. None of it was grand, but it was real. And after years of chaos, real was all I ever wanted. One afternoon there was a knock at my sister's door. She called to tell me he had shown up, asking to speak to me. I told her to send him away. She hesitated, saying he looked lost. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost, but then I remembered the night he brought his lover home and introduced her like I was invisible. Pity faded. Some wounds don't need to be reopened. They need to be respected as lessons. I thanked my sister for standing firm. He could knock all he wanted. I was done answering. He found my new address somehow and came by unannounced. I was standing on the porch when he walked up the path, slower than I'd ever seen him move. For a moment we just stared at each other. He looked smaller, deflated. I could see he'd rehearsed something, words that once would have disarmed me. But they didn't now. The space between us felt like a canyon carved by years of silence and truth. I waited, calm, unshaken. I didn't owe him anger. I owed myself peace, and I wasn't going to trade it for anything. He stopped a few feet away, unsure. The confidence that once filled his every move was gone. He called my name softly, but it didn't sound the same. I saw a man, not a monster, just a man broken by his own ego. And in that moment, I realized forgiveness wasn't about him. It was about freeing myself from the grip of resentment. I didn't need to hate him to move on. I simply needed to stop caring about what he thought. So I turned slightly, signaling that the past had no seat here anymore. He asked how I could just leave everything behind, how I could survive without him. The words were familiar, like echoes of the arrogance that used to hold me captive. I looked at him quietly, remembering every moment I'd built alone since leaving. He didn't understand that I hadn't survived without him. I'd lived because I left him. Survival had nothing to do with staying. It came from walking away when everything inside you says you can't. I didn't need to explain that to him. My life already was the answer he refused to believe. He kept talking, reaching for guilt, for emotion, for anything he could twist into control, but there was nothing left for him to grab. I'd grown out of that kind of power. I told him, calmly and simply, that I was doing fine. The words felt light, almost weightless. He looked stunned, like he couldn't imagine a world where I didn't depend on him. And that was the most satisfying truth of all. I didn't need him to fall apart for me to feel free. I just needed to stop being his reflection. He tried to remind me of the good times, the years we'd shared, the things we'd built. I let him talk, because some people only learn through the sound of their own disappointment. When he finished, I nodded and said nothing. He waited for anger, for emotion, but I offered none. That was the moment he realized the difference between me then and me now. The woman he'd once dismissed had become unreachable. I wasn't cruel. I was simply gone, standing in front of him, but living in a peace he could never touch. Before leaving, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small red thread. I'd kept it with me all this time. I placed it in his hand. He looked down at it, confused. To him, it was nothing. To me, it was everything. The symbol of how one small thing can unravel an entire life. I told him quietly that some knots aren't meant to be retied. He didn't respond. He just stared at the thread. Lost. I turned away, not in anger but in grace. Some endings don't need noise to be final. When I closed the door behind him, the silence that followed felt sacred. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything I'd earned. I stood there for a while, breathing, letting my heartbeat catch up to the moment. I thought I'd feel sorrow, but I didn't. I felt peace. He was gone, and I was still here. I had thought freedom would feel wild and untamed, but it was gentle. It was the sound of my own breath in a quiet room that finally belonged only to me. That's what survival truly sounded like. I sat down on the couch, wrapped a blanket around myself and looked out the window. The world outside looked calm, untouched by my story. I liked that. For years I thought my pain defined me. Now it was just something that happened, a past that no longer shaped the present. I wasn't broken, I was rebuilt. The cracks had simply become proof that I'd lived and learned. Some people look for closure in apologies. Mine was found in peace, in choosing not to carry what never belonged to me again. That evening, the distant church bell rang again. I smiled when I heard it. It had followed me all this way, marking every turning point. I didn't know if it was coincidence or fate, but it didn't matter. It reminded me that life keeps moving, always forward, never back. I whispered a small thank you to the sound, to myself, to everything that led me here. The bell wasn't calling me anymore. It was simply echoing my own rhythm, steady and sure, reminding me that peace can be loud in its own quiet way. I built a new routine around my small joys: work, coffee, evening walks. I filled my home with things that reflected me: plants, books, photos from new memories. Each day felt like adding color to a life that had been gray for too long. I didn't rush anything. Healing doesn't happen on command, it unfolds in layers. Every morning I'd wake up, stretch, and think, this is my life. It was simple, unremarkable to anyone else, but to me it was everything. It was proof that peace doesn't need drama to feel meaningful. Months later, someone mentioned he'd moved away. I didn't ask where. The story no longer mattered. Maybe he'd try to rebuild too. maybe not. Either way, I wished him peace in my heart. Carrying hatred felt heavy, and I had no room for that anymore. Forgiveness wasn't about letting him off the hook. It was about cutting the line that had tied us together for too long. I had spent enough time dragging dead weight. Now, I walked lightly, unburdened, free to live without looking over my shoulder for the next storm. I heard she had left him soon after things fell apart. I didn't judge her. She was just another person caught in his charm the same way I once was. I hoped she'd find her strength too. I didn't need her to fail for me to feel right. Life had already balanced itself out. I was proof of that. The world doesn't need revenge stories, it needs stories of people who get up, keep walking, and never turn bitter. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living proof that peace is the best kind of justice. I passed by the old neighborhood once just to see it. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The new owners had painted the door blue. The yard looked alive again. I didn't feel nostalgia, just gratitude. That house had been my cage and my classroom. It taught me everything I needed to know about strength, endurance, and letting go. I smiled, turned away, and walked down the street with the sun on my back. The past was behind me in every sense of the word, right where it belonged. At work, I met a group of women who became my friends. We shared lunches, stories, and quiet laughter. None of them knew my past, but somehow they treated me like someone worth knowing. That was new to me. It felt strange at first, being seen for who I was and not what I'd endured. Every time I laughed with them, I felt another piece of the old me fading away. Healing isn't a straight path, it's a series of small moments that remind you life can still be good again. One evening I opened my drawer and found the small red thread coiled neatly inside. I'd taken it back after he left. I didn't know why, maybe to remind myself of how far I'd come. I held it for a while, smiling. That thread wasn't about pain anymore. It was about power. The quiet, steady kind that doesn't need to shout. I placed it back carefully, like a token of survival. It reminded me that sometimes, the things that unravel us also teach us how to weave something stronger. Weeks later, I got another call from him. He said he wanted to meet, to understand, to apologize. I thought about it for a long moment before agreeing, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to see if closure looked different now that I was whole. I didn't go to punish or forgive. I went to confirm who I'd become. Sometimes seeing what you've outgrown is the best proof of growth. I wasn't nervous. I was ready, calm, and curious to see the man who once believed I couldn't survive without him. We met at a quiet cafe in the afternoon. He looked older, weary, like someone who had carried too much pride for too long. He started talking right away, apologizing, explaining, justifying. I listened without interrupting. His words washed over me like background noise. I didn't need to respond with anger or pity. I just let him speak. When he finally stopped, I said one simple thing. I'm doing well. That was all. No lecture, no blame, just truth. His eyes softened, maybe realizing for the first time that he had truly lost me. He said he wanted to understand how I'd done it, how I'd rebuilt so completely. I told him the truth. I stopped believing you were the center of my life. He nodded slowly, maybe for the first time seeing what he'd really destroyed. There was no satisfaction in his pain, only confirmation. I had grown in the spaces he tried to fill with control. When he stood to leave, I wished him well, not out of love, but completion. We were finished, not broken, not burning, just done, and that was enough. After he left, I sat alone at that cafe table, watching people pass by outside. The world looked ordinary again, and I liked that. I didn't need big endings or dramatic moments. My story didn't end in revenge, it ended in peace. I finished my coffee and felt an unfamiliar lightness in my chest. For the first time, I wasn't carrying anything heavy. The woman who once thought she'd never recover had quietly become her own miracle. I stood up, smiled at my reflection in the window, and walked out into the sunlight. That evening I stood by my apartment window, the city glowing beneath me. The distant bell rang one last time, soft and clear. I closed my eyes and let it echo through me. I thought of everything I'd lost, and everything I'd gained. Freedom, peace. Myself, I whispered a quiet thank you to the woman I used to be. The one who endured so I could become this version of me. Betrayal hadn't destroyed me, it had revealed me. I smiled, steady and sure. I hadn't just survived. I had finally learned to live.